My name is Margaret, and I turned 32 last Tuesday. What should have been a celebration of another year of life became the day I discovered just how far my own mother would go to keep me under her control. As I stood in our family kitchen that morning watching her carefully frost my favorite chocolate cake, something felt different. Her movements were too precise, too secretive. When she thought I wasn't looking, I saw her sprinkle something white over the frosting that definitely wasn't powdered sugar. I should have been terrified, but instead I smiled and started planning my next move. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Trust me, you won't believe what happened next when that cake was finally served. Growing up in suburban Columbus, Ohio, our family looked picture-perfect from the outside. Dad Harold worked as an insurance adjuster, Mom Eleanor kept an immaculate house, and my older brother Warren was the golden child who could do no wrong. I was the baby 5 years younger than Warren, and for most of my childhood I basked in the warmth of what I thought was unconditional parental love. Our house on Maple Street was the kind neighbors admired. 2 stories of brick and vinyl siding with Eleanor's prize-winning rose garden out front, and a swimming pool in the back where we spent countless summer afternoons. Eleanor was the type of mother who volunteered for every school event, baked cookies for bake sales, and knew all the other parents by name. She had this way of making everyone feel special when they were in her presence, like they were the most important person in the world. But there were signs, even then, that something wasn't quite right. Eleanor needed to know where I was every minute of every day. She'd call the school to check on me during lunch periods. When I wanted to spend the night at friends' houses, she'd find reasons why it wasn't a good idea. The friends' parents were too permissive, or their house wasn't clean enough, or she just had a bad feeling about it. Warren noticed it too, but he'd always defend her when I complained. "She just loves you, Maggie," he'd say, using the nickname only he was allowed to call me. "She worries because you're her baby girl." Everything changed when I was 16 and Dad died in a car accident on Interstate 71. A drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into Dad's sedan as he was coming home from work on a rainy Thursday evening. The call came at 8:15 p.m. just as we were finishing dinner. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the kitchen clock, annoyed that Dad was late and his meatloaf was getting cold. Eleanor answered the phone, and I watched her face transform from mild irritation to absolute devastation in the span of seconds. The plate she was holding crashed to the floor, and she just stood there gripping the phone like it was an anchor in a storm. Warren jumped up to catch her before she collapsed, and I knew without being told that our lives had just shattered into a million pieces. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and casseroles. Half the town showed up to pay their respects, and Eleanor played the grieving widow perfectly. She wore her pain like a badge of honor, accepting condolences with grace, while leaning heavily on Warren's strong shoulder. I felt invisible in my grief, watching everyone focus on comforting her, while I struggled to understand how the man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra homework would never walk through our front door again. After the funeral, Eleanor's grief hardened into something else entirely. The life insurance payout was substantial, nearly $500,000, and she guarded it like a dragon protecting treasure. She made it clear that this money was our security, our future, and that any decisions about it would go through her. Warren was 21 and finishing college, so he didn't need much, but I was still in high school and completely dependent on her for everything. That's when the real control began. Eleanor enrolled me in a private Catholic school, claiming the public school couldn't provide the structure I needed during such a difficult time. She hired tutors for subjects I was already excelling in. She signed me up for piano lessons, French classes, and charity volunteer work, filling every moment of my free time, so I wouldn't have the chance to develop independence or, God forbid, meet boys. Warren tried to intervene sometimes, suggesting I should have more freedom to grieve and heal in my own way. But Eleanor had developed this ability to make him feel guilty for questioning her judgment. She'd bring up how hard she was working to keep our family together, how she was sacrificing her own happiness to make sure we turned out right, and how disappointed Dad would be if we didn't appreciate her efforts. I graduated high school with perfect grades and a full scholarship to Ohio State University an hour away in Columbus. For a brief moment, I thought I might finally have some independence. Eleanor had other ideas. She insisted I live at home and commute, claiming it would save money and keep the family close. When I protested, she reminded me that the scholarship only covered tuition and I'd need her financial support for books, gas, and spending money. "This is what your father would have wanted," she'd say whenever I pushed back. "He left that insurance money to take care of you, not to fund your rebellion." College became a carefully orchestrated routine. Eleanor would drive me to campus each morning and pick me up each afternoon. I wasn't allowed to join clubs or make study groups that met in the evenings. My social life consisted of approved church activities and family gatherings with Eleanor's sisters Phyllis and Joan, who thought she was doing a wonderful job raising 2 children on her own. But Warren saw what was happening. During his visits home from graduate school, he'd pull me aside and encourage me to stand up for myself. He'd offer to help me find an apartment or co-sign for student loans so I could have some independence. Eleanor would sense these conversations happening and manufacture some crisis that required his immediate attention. A mysterious illness that meant she couldn't drive me to school. A problem with the house that only he could fix. Bills that suddenly became too complicated for her to handle alone. By the time I was 25, I'd graduated with a degree in marketing and landed a job at a small advertising agency in Columbus. Eleanor finally agreed to let me move out, but only because Warren convinced her that living closer to work would save money on gas and wear on the car. Even then, she found ways to maintain control. She'd call multiple times a day to check on me. She'd show up at my apartment unannounced with groceries or cleaning supplies, claiming she was just being helpful while subtly critiquing how I was living. The apartment I found was a modest 1-bedroom in a complex near downtown. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I could eat cereal for dinner if I wanted to, or stay up all night watching movies, or leave dirty dishes in the sink without someone commenting on my lack of discipline. Eleanor hated every minute of my independence, but she tolerated it as long as I came home for dinner every Sunday and called her every morning and evening. That's how I met Dennis. He was the building maintenance manager, a gentle man 3 years older than me, with kind brown eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. He fixed my leaky faucet one Tuesday afternoon and stayed for coffee when I offered it. We talked for hours about books and movies and dreams for the future. He was everything Eleanor despised, working-class divorced, and completely unimpressed by her attempts to intimidate him. Our relationship developed slowly over 6 months of casual conversations and shared meals. Dennis understood family complications because he'd been through a difficult divorce with an ex-wife who tried to use their daughter as a weapon against him. He never pushed me to talk about Eleanor's controlling behavior, but he listened when I needed to vent about her latest manipulation tactics. When Dennis finally met Eleanor at a Sunday dinner, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. She was polite but cold, asking pointed questions about his education, his financial prospects, and his intentions regarding her daughter. Dennis answered every question honestly and respectfully, but I could see Eleanor's jaw tighten with each response that didn't meet her standards. After he left that evening, Eleanor sat me down at the kitchen table, where we'd had so many important conversations over the years. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were hard as flint when she told me exactly what she thought of my new boyfriend. "He's using you, Margaret. Can't you see that a man his age with a failed marriage and a blue-collar job dating a college-educated woman with prospects, he sees dollar signs when he looks at you?" I tried to explain that Dennis wasn't like that he'd never even asked about my family's financial situation, but Eleanor had made up her mind. This was the beginning of a war I didn't even know I was fighting. 3 months ago, on a warm Sunday evening in late summer, I made the decision that would change everything. Dennis had proposed 2 weeks earlier with a simple but beautiful engagement ring he'd saved for months to afford. We'd kept the news to ourselves while we figured out how to tell our families, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer to share our happiness. The Sunday dinner routine had been sacred in our family since Dad's death. Every week at 5 p.m., sharp Warren and I would gather around Eleanor's dining room table for pot roast or chicken casserole, mashed potatoes, and green beans. It was Eleanor's way of maintaining family unity, and neither of us had ever missed one unless we were seriously ill or out of town. That particular evening, Eleanor had outdone herself. The table was set with her good china, the ones with tiny blue flowers that had belonged to her grandmother. Homemade rolls were warming in the oven, filling the house with the smell of yeast and butter. Warren had driven down from Cleveland, where he was working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, and we were catching up on each other's weeks when I decided the time was right. "I have something to tell you both," I announced, unable to keep the smile off my face as I held up my left hand to show off the modest but sparkling diamond ring. Warren's face lit up immediately. He jumped from his chair to examine the ring and pull me into a bear hug that lifted me off my feet. "Maggie, this is incredible. When did this happen? Why didn't you call me?" But Eleanor's reaction was the opposite of celebration. She stared at the ring like it was a poisonous snake coiled around my finger. Her face went completely white, then flushed red with an anger I'd rarely seen before. The serving spoon she was holding clattered against her plate as her hand began to shake. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Warren's excited chatter about wedding plans and bachelor parties. "I've gotten engaged, Mom. Dennis proposed 2 weeks ago and I said yes. We're thinking about a spring wedding, something small and simple." The explosion that followed will be burned into my memory forever. Eleanor shot up from her chair with such force that it toppled backward, crashing to the hardwood floor. Her carefully prepared dinner was forgotten as she swept her arm across the table, sending plates and glasses flying. Pot roast and gravy splattered across the wall behind Warren's head as he ducked to avoid the flying debris. "Over my dead body," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "Over my dead body, will you leave this family for that man?" Warren immediately moved to calm her down, speaking in the soothing tones he'd perfected over the years of managing Eleanor's emotional outbursts. But this was different from her usual dramatics. This was raw primal fury, mixed with what looked like genuine panic. "Mom, please let's talk about this rationally," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I'm not leaving the family. I'm starting my own family. There's a difference." "No, there isn't," she snapped back, pointing an accusing finger at me. "He's poisoned your mind against us. Can't you see that first he'll convince you to move away? Then he'll turn you against your own mother and brother. Before you know it, you'll be just like his ex-wife, bitter and alone with nothing to show for it." The attack on Dennis was unfair and completely unfounded, but I recognized the pattern. This was how Eleanor had always dealt with threats to her control. She'd create elaborate scenarios in her mind about how people were trying to hurt our family, then present these fictional narratives as absolute truth. Warren spent the next hour cleaning up the mess while trying to mediate between us. He suggested we all take a few days to cool down and then sit down for a calm conversation about the engagement and what it meant for our family dynamics. Eleanor agreed to this plan, but I could see in her eyes that she was already plotting her next move. The campaign against Dennis began the very next day. Eleanor started by calling every relative in our extended family tree to share her concerns about my poor judgment and the negative influence of my fiancé. She painted herself as the worried mother trying to save her daughter from making a terrible mistake. By the time these conversations made their way back to me through various cousins and aunts, the stories had been embellished into tales of Dennis being abusive, controlling, and potentially dangerous. Aunt Phyllis called me on Tuesday morning, her voice heavy with concern. "Margaret, honey, your mother is worried sick about you. She says this man has completely changed your personality and isolated you from your family. Is everything okay?" I spent an hour explaining that none of that was true, that Dennis had never tried to control me or isolate me from anyone, and that Eleanor was manufacturing drama because she couldn't accept that I was growing up and making my own choices. Phyllis listened politely, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. Eleanor's version of events was more dramatic and therefore more believable to people who didn't understand the history of manipulation. The harassment escalated throughout the week. Dennis started receiving anonymous phone calls at work with the caller hanging up as soon as he answered. Someone left threatening notes on his truck windshield, warning him to stay away from me or face consequences. When we tried to go out for dinner Friday night, we discovered that all 4 of his tires had been slashed while we were inside the restaurant. Dennis handled it all with remarkable patience, but I could see the stress wearing on him. He'd been through enough drama with his ex-wife and didn't deserve to inherit my family's dysfunction. When I apologized for Eleanor's behavior, he just pulled me close and promised that we'd figure it out together. Warren called me the following Sunday to let me know he'd confronted Eleanor about the escalating harassment. He'd found evidence in her bedroom that she was behind at least some of the incidents, a notebook filled with Dennis's work schedule, and the locations of restaurants where we'd been spotted together. "She's not handling this well, Maggie," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "I've never seen her this upset about anything, not even when Dad died. You need to be careful around her right now." The warning proved prophetic. Eleanor's behavior became increasingly erratic over the following weeks. She'd call me crying hysterically about feeling abandoned, then hang up and refuse to answer when I tried to call back. She'd show up at my apartment building at odd hours sometimes, just sitting in her car watching my windows until Dennis noticed her and asked her to leave. The breaking point came when Eleanor made one final desperate attempt at reconciliation. She called me on a Thursday evening, her voice sweet and apologetic, claiming she'd been thinking about everything and realized she'd overreacted. She wanted to throw me a special birthday party, she said, to celebrate both my 32nd birthday and my engagement. "I've been a terrible mother," she said, her words carefully chosen and delivered with just the right amount of vulnerability. "I was so scared of losing you that I forgot the most important thing is your happiness. Dennis seems like a good man, and if he makes you happy, then I want to welcome him into our family properly." I wanted to believe her. Despite everything that had happened, she was still my mother, and part of me desperately wanted her approval and support. Warren was cautiously optimistic when I told him about the phone call, suggesting that maybe the shock of the engagement had finally worn off and Eleanor was ready to accept reality. Dennis was less convinced. "Your mom looks at me like she wants to murder me," he said when I told him about the party invitation. "I don't think people change their minds that quickly about something they feel so strongly about." But I overruled his concerns, desperate for the chance to repair our fractured family relationships. The party was scheduled for the following Tuesday, my actual birthday, and Eleanor promised to invite Warren and a few close relatives for a small, intimate celebration. As I got ready for work that Monday morning, I had no idea that Eleanor was already putting her final, most dangerous plan into motion. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when I arrived at Eleanor's house Monday evening to help with party preparations. I'd offered to bring dessert or help with cooking, but she'd insisted on handling everything herself. When I knocked on the front door at 6 p.m., it took her nearly 5 minutes to answer, and when she finally appeared, her eyes were red-rimmed and slightly unfocused. "Oh, Margaret, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow," she said, blocking the doorway with her body, as if she didn't want me to come inside. "We talked about this yesterday, Mom. I offered to help you get ready for the party, remember?" She stared at me for a long moment, then stepped aside reluctantly. The house, usually immaculate, was in disarray. Mail was scattered across the coffee table, dirty dishes were piled in the sink, and there were several empty prescription bottles on the kitchen counter that I'd never seen before. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned by her disheveled appearance. "Maybe we should postpone the party if you're not well." "No," she said quickly, her voice sharp with panic. "No, the party has to be tomorrow. I've already bought all the groceries and invited everyone. I just need to get organized." I spent the next 2 hours helping her clean the house and prepare ingredients for the next day's meal. Eleanor seemed distracted and jumpy, constantly checking her phone and peering out the windows as if she was expecting someone. When I asked about the prescription bottles, she claimed they were old medications she was throwing away. As I was getting ready to leave, Eleanor grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Her fingernails dug into my skin as she pulled me close, her breath smelling strangely sweet and medicinal. "You're still my little girl," she whispered, her voice taking on a dreamy, distant quality. "No matter what happens tomorrow, remember that everything I do is because I love you more than life itself." The comment sent chills down my spine, but I chalked it up to Eleanor being overly emotional about my upcoming marriage. I kissed her cheek and promised to be back early the next morning to help with final preparations. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my increasingly anxious mood. Dennis had left for a 3-day business trip to Cincinnati, and Warren was driving down from Cleveland after his morning meetings. I'd barely slept, troubled by strange dreams about my father and vague feelings that something terrible was about to happen. Eleanor was already dressed and busy in the kitchen when I arrived at 8 a.m. She'd set up a card table in the living room with my gifts and was arranging flowers in her best crystal vase. On the surface, everything looked normal, but there was an undercurrent of tension that made me feel like I was walking on thin ice. "I thought I'd make your favorite chocolate cake," she announced, gesturing toward the ingredients laid out on the counter. "The one with fudge frosting that you loved as a child." I hadn't had that particular cake in years, not since my teenage birthday parties, but I smiled and thanked her for the thoughtful gesture. As the morning progressed, relatives began arriving for the 1 p.m. celebration. Aunt Phyllis brought her famous potato salad, Aunt Joan contributed a green bean casserole, and my cousin Beverly showed up with a bottle of champagne and a beautifully wrapped gift. Eleanor was playing the role of gracious hostess, perfectly accepting compliments on the decorations and expressing excitement about welcoming Dennis into the family. But I noticed she kept checking the clock and seemed increasingly agitated as the afternoon wore on. "Where's that fiancé of yours?" Aunt Phyllis asked around 12:30. "I'm looking forward to finally meeting the man who swept our Margaret off her feet." "He's on a business trip," I explained. "He'll be back Thursday night just in time for our weekend wedding planning session." Eleanor's face flickered with what looked like relief, though she quickly covered it with a disappointed expression. "What a shame he'll miss the party. I was so hoping to apologize for my behavior and start fresh with him." Warren arrived just as Eleanor was putting the finishing touches on my birthday cake. He bounded through the front door with his arms full of packages and his usual infectious enthusiasm, sweeping me into a hug that lifted me off my feet. "Happy birthday, little sister," he announced, setting me down and ruffling my hair like he used to do when we were kids. 32 years of putting up with your big brother deserves some serious celebrating." Eleanor emerged from the kitchen carrying the most beautiful chocolate cake I'd ever seen. It was 3 layers tall with perfectly smooth fudge frosting and delicate sugar flowers arranged around the edges. 32 candles were evenly spaced across the top, waiting to be lit for the traditional birthday song. "Oh, Mom, it's gorgeous," I said, meaning every word. Despite all our recent conflicts, Eleanor had always been a talented baker, and she'd outdone herself with this creation. As everyone gathered around the dining room table for the candle lighting ceremony, I happened to glance toward the kitchen and caught a glimpse of Eleanor through the doorway. She was standing at the counter with her back to us, and I watched in horror as she picked up a small white envelope and carefully sprinkled its contents over the frosting of my cake. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The powder wasn't sugar or any normal cake decoration. Eleanor's movements were too deliberate, too secretive, and the way she quickly disposed of the envelope suggested she was doing something she knew was wrong. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The prescription bottles I'd seen the night before. Eleanor's strange behavior and unfocused eyes. Her insistence that the party had to happen today when Dennis was conveniently out of town. The way she'd specifically asked about his travel schedule 2 weeks ago. Eleanor was drugging my birthday cake. Time seemed to slow down as I processed what I'd just witnessed. Eleanor returned to the dining room with a bright smile, setting the cake in front of me as everyone began singing Happy Birthday. I forced myself to smile and clap along, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do next. The logical response would have been to immediately confront Eleanor to demand an explanation for what I'd seen and to prevent anyone from eating the contaminated cake. But something deeper and more calculating took over. I realized this might be my only chance to expose Eleanor's true nature to the rest of our family people, who had always seen her as the devoted single mother who could do no wrong. As the song ended and everyone applauded, Eleanor handed me a knife to cut the first slice. "Make a wish, sweetheart," she said, her eyes bright with anticipation that now seemed sinister rather than loving. I closed my eyes and made my wish that everyone would finally see Eleanor for who she really was. Then I opened them and smiled at my mother as I cut a generous slice from the center of the cake, making sure to include plenty of the frosting where I'd seen her sprinkle the powder. "This looks absolutely delicious, Mom. You've really outdone yourself." Eleanor beamed with pride as I transferred the slice to a plate. Her hands were trembling slightly with excitement as she watched me pick up my fork. This was the moment she'd been planning for the culmination of whatever twisted scheme she'd devised to regain control over my life. But Warren, bless his heart, had other ideas. "Wait a minute, birthday girl," he said playfully, snatching the plate from in front of me. "Big brother gets the first taste to make sure it's safe. Family tradition, remember." I wanted to scream to grab the plate back to explain that this wasn't a game and that he was putting himself in real danger. But too many people were watching, and I couldn't expose Eleanor's plan without concrete proof that would convince everyone she was capable of such betrayal. "Warren, no, it's my birthday cake," I protested weakly, hoping he'd pick up on the urgency in my voice. "Don't be selfish, Maggie." He laughed already, raising the fork to his mouth. "Just one bite to make sure our dear mother didn't accidentally add salt instead of sugar." Eleanor's face had gone completely white. She was staring at Warren with undisguised horror, her mouth opening as if she wanted to stop him, but couldn't find the words. I saw her take a half step forward, her hand reaching out instinctively to knock the fork away from his lips, but it was too late. Warren took a generous bite of cake and frosting, chewing thoughtfully, as he made exaggerated faces of appreciation. Definitely not salt," he announced to the delighted laughter of our relatives. "This might be the best chocolate cake you've ever made, Mom." For about 30 seconds, everything seemed normal. Warren continued joking with our cousins while Eleanor stood frozen by the table watching him with the intensity of someone waiting for a time bomb to explode. I kept my eyes fixed on both of them, looking for any sign of what was about to happen. The first indication that something was wrong came when Warren's laughter began to sound strange, slightly slurred at the edges. He was in the middle of telling Aunt Joan about his new apartment in Cleveland when his words started running together in ways that didn't make sense. "The landlord is the apartment has great, I can see the lake from—" He stopped mid-sentence, looking confused and slightly embarrassed. "Sorry, I don't know why I can't finish my thoughts today." Cousin Beverly, who worked as a nurse at Cleveland General, looked concerned. "Warren, are you feeling okay? You look a little flushed." That's when I noticed the changes in his appearance. His face was indeed flushed with bright red patches on his cheeks that made him look feverish. His eyes were becoming glassy and unfocused, and when he tried to stand up to get a glass of water, he swayed dangerously to one side. "Whoa there, big guy," said Aunt Phyllis, steadying him with her hands on his shoulders. "Maybe you should sit back down." "I'm fine," Warren insisted, but his words were definitely slurred now, like he'd been drinking heavily, even though he'd only had half a glass of wine with lunch. "Just a little dizzy or something. Must be working too hard." Eleanor finally found her voice, but instead of expressing concern for Warren's condition, she seemed to be having some kind of breakdown. "No, no, no," she kept repeating under her breath. Her hands pressed against her cheeks as she stared at him in horror. "That was supposed to be... This isn't how..." She caught herself before finishing the sentence, but I'd heard enough to confirm my worst suspicions. Eleanor had drugged the cake specifically for me, and Warren's playful gesture had completely derailed whatever plan she'd had in mind. Within minutes, Warren's condition deteriorated dramatically. He was having trouble keeping his eyes open, and when he tried to speak, his words came out as garbled nonsense. His coordination was completely shot. When he attempted to pick up his water glass, his hand missed it entirely and knocked over the salt shaker instead. "Something's really wrong," Beverly announced, her nurse training kicking into high gear. She was checking Warren's pulse and examining his pupils with the flashlight from her keychain. His heart rate is way too slow, and look at how dilated his pupils are. This looks like some kind of drug reaction. Eleanor let out a strangled sob and rushed toward the kitchen, claiming she needed to call 911. But I followed her and saw that instead of reaching for the phone, she was frantically opening cabinets and drawers looking for something. When she spotted me in the doorway, she whirled around with guilt written all over her face. "What did you put in that cake, Mom?" I asked quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but tears were streaming down her cheeks and her whole body was shaking. "I saw you sprinkle something over the frosting. Warren is in the next room barely conscious because of whatever you put in my birthday cake." "What was it?" Eleanor collapsed against the kitchen counter, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling completely. "It wasn't supposed to be him," she sobbed. "It was supposed to be you. Just enough to make you compliant to help you think more clearly about this engagement. You would have woken up tomorrow realizing that Dennis isn't right for you, and everything would have gone back to normal." The casual way she described her plan to drug me into submission was almost more horrifying than the act itself. In Eleanor's twisted mind, she was still the loving mother trying to protect her daughter from making a mistake. The fact that she was willing to chemically alter my mental state to achieve that goal apparently seemed reasonable to her. "What did you give him, Mom? The paramedics are going to need to know what they're dealing with." "Anxiety medication," she admitted, her voice barely audible over Warren's increasingly labored breathing from the dining room. "And sleeping pills. I ground them up together. I researched the dosage online. I swear I was careful. It should have just made you sleepy and suggestible, not like this." I stared at my mother, this woman who had given birth to me and raised me and claimed to love me more than anything in the world, and realized I was looking at a stranger. The Eleanor I thought I knew would never have been capable of something this calculated and dangerous. But the evidence was right in front of me, along with my brother's deteriorating condition, as proof of her willingness to cross any line to maintain control. The sound of sirens in the distance meant that someone in the dining room had managed to call for help while Eleanor and I were having our confrontation in the kitchen. I left her sobbing against the counter and returned to Warren, who was now completely unconscious and struggling to breathe normally. Beverly had positioned him on his side on the living room couch and was monitoring his vital signs, while Aunt Phyllis coordinated with the 911 dispatcher over the phone. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and I watched helplessly as they worked to stabilize Warren before loading him onto a stretcher and rushing him to Columbus General Hospital. As the ambulance pulled away with its lights flashing, I realized that my 32nd birthday had become the day everything changed forever. The emergency room at Columbus General was a blur of harsh fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the waiting area, still wearing my birthday dress, watching Eleanor pace back and forth across the polished linoleum floor. She'd been crying steadily for the past 2 hours, alternately blaming herself and trying to convince me that everything was a terrible misunderstanding. Warren had been rushed into intensive care as soon as the ambulance arrived. The paramedics had managed to stabilize his breathing during the transport, but the emergency room doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Dr. Patricia Chen, explained that they were still trying to determine exactly what combination of drugs was in his system and how much damage had been done. "We've identified traces of lorazepam and zolpidem in his blood work," Dr. Chen told me during her first update. "Those are anti-anxiety and sleep medications, respectively. In the quantities we're seeing, they could have caused respiratory depression, especially in combination with the alcohol he consumed at lunch." I felt sick knowing that Warren's life was in danger because of a half glass of wine he'd enjoyed with our family meal. Eleanor's research into drug interactions had apparently been less thorough than she'd claimed. Aunt Phyllis and Aunt Joan had followed us to the hospital, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion about the circumstances of Warren's sudden illness. During the long wait for updates, I'd had to explain multiple times that Warren hadn't been taking any medications that would account for the drugs in his system, and no, he hadn't been acting depressed or suicidal lately. The questions became more pointed when Dr. Chen asked to speak with me privately about the timeline of Warren's symptoms and whether there was any possibility that he'd been drugged without his knowledge. I found myself at a crossroads. I could continue protecting Eleanor by claiming ignorance, or I could tell the truth and expose her attempt to drug me. The decision became easier when I remembered Eleanor's own words in the kitchen. It wasn't supposed to be him. Warren was fighting for his life because of a plan specifically designed to incapacitate me and undermine my ability to make my own choices about marriage and my future. There's something you need to know. I told Dr. Chen, and then I explained everything I'd witnessed from Eleanor's suspicious behavior over the past weeks to the moment I saw her sprinkle powder over my birthday cake. Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly serious as I described Eleanor's admission about grinding up her prescription medications and researching dosages online. She excused herself to make some phone calls, and 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived to take my statement and question Eleanor about the incident. Eleanor initially tried to deny everything, claiming I was confused or lying out of anger about some unrelated family conflict. But when the officers explained that they would be testing the remaining cake for traces of the same drugs found in Warren's blood, she finally broke down and confessed to the entire plan. Watching my mother being read her rights and handcuffed in the hospital waiting room was surreal beyond description. The woman who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with homework was being arrested for attempted poisoning, and I was the primary witness against her. Aunt Phyllis was crying openly, unable to reconcile the Eleanor she'd known for decades with the person capable of such a calculated attack on her own child. "I don't understand," she kept repeating. "Eleanor would never hurt Margaret or Warren. She loves them more than anything." But Aunt Joan, who had always been more perceptive about family dynamics, was putting the pieces together. "She's been getting worse since Margaret announced her engagement," she said quietly. "More controlling, more paranoid. Last week she called me crying about how Dennis was going to turn Margaret against the whole family. I thought she was just having empty nest syndrome, but this is something else entirely." While Eleanor was being processed at the police station, I maintained my vigil at Warren's bedside in the ICU. The doctors had pumped his stomach and were using activated charcoal to absorb any remaining drugs in his system, but they warned me that it would be several hours before they'd know if there had been any permanent damage to his respiratory or nervous systems. Warren looked so pale and vulnerable, connected to all those machines, nothing like the strong big brother who had always protected me from the world's cruelties. Now I was the one trying to protect him, making medical decisions and fielding calls from his employer about his unexpected absence from work. Dennis called around midnight, having received my frantic voicemail about Warren's hospitalization. I'd left out the details about Eleanor's involvement, simply saying that Warren had had some kind of reaction to medication and was in intensive care. "I'm driving back tonight," Dennis said immediately. "I can be there in 4 hours." "No, don't do that. The roads are terrible with all this rain, and there's nothing you can do here anyway. Warren's stable and I have family with me." But Dennis knew me well enough to hear the strain in my voice, and he persisted until I finally told him the whole story. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought the call had been dropped. "Your mother tried to drug you," he finally said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Margaret, she could have killed you, or Warren. Do you understand how serious this is?" I did understand, but hearing it put so bluntly by someone I loved made the reality hit even harder. Eleanor hadn't just been trying to control me, she'd been willing to risk my life to do it. The dosage calculations she'd done online were based on her assumptions about my weight and tolerance, not any actual medical knowledge. She'd essentially been conducting a chemistry experiment using her own daughter as a test subject. The next morning brought better news about Warren's condition. Dr. Chen reported that his vital signs were stabilizing and the drugs were working their way out of his system without causing permanent damage. He was expected to make a full recovery, though he'd need several more days of observation to monitor for any delayed reactions. Eleanor spent the night in jail and was arraigned the following afternoon on charges of attempted poisoning and reckless endangerment. The bail hearing was surreal. I sat in the gallery watching my mother in an orange jumpsuit, listening to a prosecutor describe her as a danger to her own children and a flight risk. Warren woke up Thursday evening groggy and confused but alive and speaking coherently. His first words were an apology for eating my birthday cake, which broke my heart all over again. "I'm so sorry, Maggie," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed earlier that day. "If I hadn't been fooling around, you would have been the one." "Don't you dare apologize," I said, gripping his hand tightly. "You saved my life by being your usual annoying self. If you'd let me eat that cake, I might not have been conscious enough to get help when the drugs kicked in." As Warren's strength returned over the next few days, we had long conversations about Eleanor's behavior and mental state. He admitted that he'd been concerned about her for months, but hadn't known how to address it without seeming disloyal or ungrateful for everything she'd sacrificed for our family. "I keep thinking about Dad," he said during one of these talks. "If he knew what Mom had done, what she'd been planning to do to you, he would have been devastated. The woman who tried to drug you isn't the same person he married and loved." Warren's observation forced me to confront a painful truth I'd been avoiding. The Eleanor who had raised us, who had made sacrifices and shown love in her own imperfect way, was gone. In her place was someone driven by fear and control to the point of endangering the very people she claimed to love most. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Eleanor's lawyer recommended that she plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for mandatory psychiatric treatment and community service. The alternative was a trial that would likely result in prison time and even more public humiliation for our family. I found myself in the unexpected position of having to decide whether to support the plea agreement or push for harsher punishment. Part of me wanted Eleanor to face the full consequences of her actions, but a larger part still hoped that she could get the help she needed and possibly salvage some relationship with her children. The decision ultimately came down to what would be best for Warren's recovery and our family's future. We were all going to need therapy to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward. Adding the stress of a lengthy trial seemed counterproductive to everyone's healing. 3 weeks after my birthday, Eleanor was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and mandatory psychiatric treatment at a residential facility. She would not be allowed to contact Warren or me without supervision until her doctors determined that she was no longer a threat to herself or others. As I watched her being led away from the courthouse, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and something that might have been hope. The woman who had tried to drug me was going to get help. Whether the Eleanor I remembered from childhood could ever be recovered remained to be seen. 6 months later, I was sitting in Dr. Sarah Williams' office for my weekly therapy session, talking about the complicated process of planning a wedding while processing family trauma. Dr. Williams specialized in helping people recover from psychological abuse, and she'd been instrumental in helping me understand that Eleanor's controlling behavior had been damaging my mental health for years before the drugging incident. "The engagement announcement wasn't the beginning of your mother's inappropriate behavior," Dr. Williams reminded me during one session. "It was just the moment when her control tactics escalated to the point where you couldn't ignore them anymore." She was right, of course. Looking back, I could see patterns of manipulation and control that stretched back to my teenage years. Eleanor's grief over Dad's death had been real, but she'd also used it as justification for increasingly invasive oversight of my life. Every major decision I'd made, from college choices to career moves, had been filtered through Eleanor's need to keep me emotionally dependent on her approval. The therapy sessions were difficult but necessary. I had to confront my own role in enabling Eleanor's behavior by consistently giving in to her demands, rather than setting firm boundaries. I'd been so afraid of hurting her feelings or seeming ungrateful that I'd allowed her to control aspects of my adult life that should have been my own responsibility. Warren was dealing with his own recovery process, both physical and emotional. The drugs had cleared his system within a few days, but the psychological impact of being poisoned by his own mother was taking much longer to process. He'd started seeing his own therapist in Cleveland and had thrown himself into his work as a way of coping with the betrayal. I keep thinking about all the times I defended her to you, he told me during one of our weekly phone calls. When you'd complain about her being too controlling, I'd tell you she just loved you and wanted what was best. I feel like I was an accomplice in my own way. Dennis had been incredibly supportive throughout the whole ordeal, but I could see the stress wearing on him as well. He'd gone from looking forward to joining a new family to having to deal with criminal proceedings and the knowledge that his future mother-in-law had tried to drug his fiancé. It would have been understandable if he'd decided our relationship came with too much baggage to be worth pursuing. Instead, he proved why Eleanor had been so wrong about his character. Dennis stood by me through every court appearance, every therapy session, and every family crisis meeting. He never pressured me to cut ties with Eleanor completely, but he also made it clear that our future together would require firm boundaries and professional help for everyone involved. "I don't want you to choose between me and your family," he said during one particularly difficult conversation, "but I also won't pretend that what happened was normal or acceptable. If we're going to build a life together, it has to be based on honesty and safety, not fear and control." The wedding planning process became a therapeutic exercise in itself. Every decision from the guest list to the venue forced me to think about what I actually wanted versus what I thought would make other people happy. For the first time in my adult life, I was making choices based purely on my own preferences and Dennis's without considering how Eleanor would react or what she would think. We decided on a small ceremony in Dennis's hometown, surrounded by people who supported our relationship unconditionally. Warren would walk me down the aisle, and Dennis's daughter from his first marriage would be our flower girl. It would be intimate and meaningful, everything Eleanor's controlling presence had prevented us from planning originally. The most difficult part was deciding what to do about Eleanor's involvement, if any. She was still in the residential treatment facility, making what her doctors described as significant progress in understanding her mental health issues and the damage her behavior had caused. Her therapist had reached out to ask if I'd be willing to participate in a family therapy session as part of Eleanor's treatment program. After discussing it extensively with Dr. Williams and Dennis, I agreed to one supervised meeting. The facility was a peaceful place surrounded by gardens, nothing like the institutional setting I'd been expecting. Eleanor looked smaller and older than I remembered, but there was a clarity in her eyes that had been missing for months before the birthday incident. The session was facilitated by Eleanor's psychiatrist, Dr. Michael Roberts, who explained that Eleanor had been diagnosed with severe anxiety disorder and obsessive-compulsive tendencies that had worsened significantly after Dad's death. Her fear of abandonment had manifested as increasingly controlling behavior, and the engagement announcement had triggered what he described as a complete psychological break. "I want you to know," Eleanor said, her voice shaky but sincere, "that I understand now how wrong I was. Not just about the cake, but about everything. The way I tried to control your life, the way I made you responsible for my emotional well-being, the way I treated Dennis without giving him a chance. None of it was love, even though I told myself it was." It was the first time Eleanor had taken full responsibility for her actions, without making excuses or blaming external circumstances. Dr. Roberts explained that this level of insight was a crucial step in her recovery, though it would take much longer to rebuild the trust she'd destroyed. I found myself crying during that session, not just from sadness, but from relief. The mother I remembered from childhood, the one who had been loving and supportive before grief and mental illness changed her, was still there somewhere. Whether we could ever have a healthy relationship again remained to be seen, but at least there was hope for healing. Eleanor asked about Warren and was devastated to learn that he wasn't ready for any contact yet. Roberts explained that Warren's recovery was complicated by the fact that he'd been Eleanor's golden child, and discovering that she'd been willing to poison him as collateral damage in her plan to control me had shattered his entire understanding of their relationship. "He'll need more time," I told Eleanor gently. "What happened to him was traumatic in ways that are different from what I experienced. I knew something was wrong with our relationship, but Warren trusted you completely. That trust is going to take time to rebuild, if it ever can be." The session ended with Eleanor expressing hope that someday, somehow, she might be able to earn forgiveness and possibly even be part of our lives again. I couldn't make any promises about the future, but I told her that her willingness to get help and take responsibility was a start. As spring arrived and our wedding date approached, I found myself thinking less about Eleanor and more about the life Dennis and I were building together. We'd found a small house to rent near his daughter's school, and I was looking forward to the challenge of becoming a stepmother. The wedding would be simple but meaningful, a celebration of love that had survived one of the most difficult tests imaginable. Warren had agreed to give a speech at the reception, and I knew he was planning to talk about the importance of chosen family and the people who stand by you during life's most challenging moments. Dennis had invited several of his closest friends from work people who had become like family to him during his difficult divorce years earlier. The guest list was small, but filled with people who genuinely cared about our happiness. There would be no drama, no manipulation, no hidden agendas. Just two people promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. Looking back on that terrible birthday 6 months earlier, I realized it had been a gift of sorts. Not the kind anyone would choose, but a wake-up call that had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my family and myself. Eleanor's attempt to control me had ultimately backfired, giving me the clarity and strength to break free from patterns of behavior that had been holding me back for years. The woman who had tried to drug me was getting the help she needed. The brother who had protected me was healing from his own trauma. And I was learning to trust my own judgment and build relationships based on mutual respect, rather than fear and obligation. It wasn't the family story I'd hoped for, but it was real and honest in ways that our previous dynamics had never been. Today marks 1 year since that birthday, and as I sit in the sunroom of the house Dennis and I now call home, I'm reflecting on how much has changed and how much healing has taken place. The morning light filters through the windows, illuminating the wedding photos on our mantel and the small vegetable garden Dennis and I planted together last spring. Warren visited last weekend for the first time since we moved here. He's doing well in Cleveland, recently promoted to senior accountant at his firm, and he's been dating a wonderful woman named Linda who works as a teacher at an elementary school. Watching him laugh and joke with Dennis over dinner, I could see that he's regained much of his natural optimism, though there are still moments when a shadow crosses his face, and I know he's thinking about that day. We talk regularly now about Eleanor and her progress in treatment. She's been transferred to a halfway house program and is working part-time at a nonprofit organization that helps families affected by mental illness. Her letters to us are thoughtful and reflective, never pushing for more contact than we're comfortable with, but always expressing hope that someday we might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship. I've started writing back to her occasionally brief notes updating her on major life events and letting her know that Warren and I are both doing well. It's not forgiveness exactly, but it's not hatred either. It's something more complex, a recognition that the person who raised me and the person who tried to drug me are the same individual dealing with mental health issues that got completely out of control. Dr. Williams and I have discussed the possibility of more family therapy sessions in the future, but only when and if Warren feels ready for that step. His recovery has been different from mine because his relationship with Eleanor had been different. As the golden child who could do no wrong, he'd never experienced her controlling behavior directly. So discovering that she was willing to sacrifice his safety for her plan to control me shattered his worldview in ways that are still painful to witness. Dennis and I celebrated our 6-month wedding anniversary last month with a quiet dinner at the restaurant where we had our first official date. His daughter Jennifer has become like a little sister to me, and watching Dennis navigate the challenges of co-parenting with his ex-wife has given me a new appreciation for how complicated family relationships can be even in the best of circumstances. Jennifer knows the basic facts about what happened with Eleanor age-appropriately explained, and she's been surprisingly wise in her observations about adults who don't know how to handle their feelings properly. Children have a way of cutting through complicated adult rationalizations to get to the heart of matters, and her matter-of-fact acceptance that Grandma Eleanor was sick and needed help has been oddly comforting. The legal aspects of Eleanor's case were resolved months ago. She completed her community service working at a food bank, which her supervisor said she approached with genuine dedication and humility. The mandatory therapy program will continue for another year with gradual increases in her freedoms and responsibilities as she demonstrates continued progress. I've learned through Dr. Williams that recovery from this type of psychological manipulation is a long process, not just for Eleanor, but for Warren and me as well. There are still moments when I question my own judgment about people and relationships, wondering if I'm being too trusting or not trusting enough. The experience has made me more aware of red flags in interpersonal dynamics, both in my personal life and in observing other families. One unexpected positive outcome has been the strengthening of my relationships with extended family members who witnessed Eleanor's behavior and stood by us during the crisis. Aunt Phyllis has become like a second mother to me, offering the kind of unconditional support and guidance that I'd been craving from Eleanor for years. Aunt Joan has been instrumental in helping Warren process his feelings about the family dynamics we grew up in. Cousin Beverly, whose nursing background helped save Warren's life that day, has become one of my closest friends. She's planning to specialize in emergency medicine and has said that the experience with Warren's poisoning reinforced her commitment to helping people during medical crises. The house Dennis and I share is filled with reminders of the life we're building together based on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. We've established traditions that have nothing to do with my childhood family dynamics, like Sunday morning pancakes and evening walks around our neighborhood. Simple pleasures that represent the kind of normal, healthy relationship I'd never thought to hope for. I've returned to work at the advertising agency with a new perspective on what really matters in life. The petty office politics and deadline pressures that used to stress me out seem manageable now compared to dealing with attempted poisoning by a family member. My colleagues have been supportive throughout the ordeal, and I've found that being honest about my experiences has helped other people open up about their own family struggles. Dennis proposed a toast during our anniversary dinner that summed up how I feel about this entire journey, to surviving the worst and discovering that we're stronger than we knew. The man Eleanor was so determined to drive away from me has proven to be exactly the partner I needed during the most difficult period of my life. As I finish writing this reflection, I'm struck by the realization that the birthday cake incident, as traumatic as it was, ultimately gave me the push I needed to break free from patterns of behavior that had been limiting my happiness for years. Eleanor's attempt to control me through chemical means was the logical extreme of a relationship dynamic that had been unhealthy long before it became dangerous. The woman who tried to drug me is getting help and taking responsibility for her actions. The brother who accidentally saved my life is building his own healthy, independent existence. And I've learned that love doesn't require sacrifice of personal autonomy, that family relationships can be renegotiated when they become toxic, and that it's possible to heal from even the most devastating betrayals when you have the right support system. If there's one lesson I hope others can take from my story, it's this: when someone's love starts to feel like a cage, even if they're family, it's okay to find the key and set yourself free. Real love wants you to flourish, not to stay small and controllable. The people who truly care about you will support your growth and independence, not try to undermine it through manipulation or worse. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their unhealthy behavior, even when that refusal comes with painful consequences. Eleanor needed to face the reality of what her controlling behavior had become, and Warren and I needed to learn that we could survive and thrive without her approval and involvement in every aspect of our lives. The healing continues and probably always will. But for the first time in my adult life, I'm living authentically as myself, not as the version of Margaret that Eleanor wanted me to be. That authenticity, painful as the journey has been to achieve it, is the most precious gift I've ever given myself. So tell me, have you ever had to make difficult choices about toxic family relationships? How did you find the strength to prioritize your own well-being? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life experiences that remind us we're not alone in facing life's most challenging moments. Share this with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to set boundaries with family members, even when it's difficult. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that you deserve relationships built on respect and genuine love, not fear and control. Until next time, take care of yourselves and trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right because they're usually trying to tell you something important.